Hi, I'm Michelle, and welcome to the Grateful Podcast, a place where we contemplate how we can eat, live, and lead each day to build a more sustainable world. Today on the podcast, I'm taking you to South Africa, more specifically to Lyndok, which is an eco-village and learning institute just on the outskirts of Stellenbosch. And this is a pretty special place. As you go through the gates, you wander through a mixed living community of eco-houses. You might see kids from the Montessori kindergarten playing next to the kids from the primary school. And as you keep walking down the path, you come across a research and learning center that covers all things sustainability in sub-Saharan Africa. And you look across the garden and see agroecology apprenticeship trainees tending to the food gardens, people chatting over lunch in the green cafe, and just generally an incredible melting pot of people from different backgrounds who are all passionate about leading more sustainable lives. And I've had the joy of running a few learning programs here at the Sustainability Institute over the last 10 years. And today I had the pleasure to chat with Jess Schulschenk, who is the director of this incredibly vibrant and diverse Sustainability Institute. I've had the chance to visit the Sustainability Institute a few times, which has been such a privilege because I think it's such a special location in the world. And I've never actually seen anything else like it. So maybe could you just tell our listeners a little bit more about what the SI is, what you do there, and what sort of makes it unique in the world?
Yeah, so I mean, maybe I can start off by saying I really don't like the name. It's one that I inherited a couple of years ago. We went through this kind of conundrum of do we keep it or not? We've been called the Instability Institute. So I kind of like the Instability Institute the most. But last year we celebrated our 20th anniversary as a nonprofit trust. And I think 20 years ago, the word sustainability invited a kind of a curiosity around what all of this work between environmental and social justice coming together could mean. And I think over the years it's been co-opted and shifted, but ultimately I think it asks of us kind of, what is it that we want to sustain and what is it that we want to change? So the Sustainability Institute, as we are known by, we're based within Lyndok Eco Village, which is, as far as I know, in South Africa and possibly in the world, the first and probably one of very few today ecologically designed communities that is deeply intentional about having kind of mixed income built into its structure. And so in South Africa, that means a mix of cultures and races and languages and belief systems as well. So it's a deeply diverse community, and our work at the center of that is running a number of education programs, but we also have food gardens and woodlands. We started in the last year, really interesting community scale food security learning farm. We have our graduates, we work in partnership with Stellenbosch University. So we have an undergrad and postgrad programs in sustainable development. And many of those students or graduates and alumni have gone on to run really incredible micro-social enterprises and solar energy and a number of different things. So as a space, it's a very vibrant community of children and kind of activists and students all coming together. It's a community kind of deeply rooted in nature and wild spaces, and trying to figure out how we could be. I think increasingly kind of what does it mean to be human, and how do we choose to respond? So transformative learning and sustainability kind of sitting at the core.
I think that's what I love so much about it, is that you really, you obviously have this connection with the university and with the educations. There's a lot of theory and thinking around sustainability, but it's inherently connected to action by you actually living it in place, which I think is really unique. And I was just wondering, what are some of the things that you've learned about, connecting the global and the local in this way, or the abstract and the concrete as you do in place there?
Sure, that's a great question. And I think it's one of the things I was looking for as I had spent a couple of years in corporate and felt quite disconnected, I think, from the impact of one's actions. And so I found myself really looking for, in a way, coming back. So I had studied at the SI many years before and worked there, and then coming back into a place where it matters not just what you think, but also the actions that you take. And it's incredibly humbling. For example, our work in food systems, we teach a number of modules, short courses. We do a lot of research on, organic hubs across Africa, setting up training and facilitation for young farmers. But when it comes down to actually sourcing locally, ethically, agroecologically, or through regenerative agriculture practices for our own little coffee shop, it's sometimes the hardest work. So I think it's in the doing that we both humbled and inspired that other ways could be possible. And I think that's kind of balancing the global perspectives with the local experience is really important. When I had just come out of my undergrad, I was overwhelmed and maybe optimistic that there was a solution out there. And if we just applied it, then everything would be fine. And so my work over the last couple of years, I think, has taught me that this work takes much deeper and longer time scales. I used to think that 3 years was a long time. I now start to think in 10, 20-year cycles. And that place really matters. And so we talk about context or place-based work, but until you have your feet in the soil and your kind of eyes locked in with another person and you're trying to figure it out, I think a lot of our work can remain theoretical and abstract. And maybe we remain subscribed to this idea that there's a solution out there if we just learned how to apply it. And I think this work has brought me a lot closer to a deep belief that the way forward lies within us already. And it's about unfolding a process together in which we'll learn a lot and we'll make a lot of mistakes, and kind of you forget your perfect offering very quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. It's where the rubber hits the road that we learn the reality of it all. Maybe related to that, like the work at the SI that I find really interesting is how you educate from, as you said, like 4 months old, I think is your youngest student, through to postgraduate training programs affiliated with the university. And are there any common things that you find people have to keep relearning across this entire age span?
So what's fascinating is we draw on a Montessori pedagogy and philosophy within our early childhood development. And so I'm not a Montessorian by my own experiences or training or that, but I am a grounded theorist. So my work and my research is we ground ourselves in kind of the reality of the world, and then we try and make sense of and evolve our theories from that. And so as a grounded kind of theory researcher and spending time with our early childhood development programs, where the underlying philosophy is really the child has this innate potential, an innate love for learning, and it's our responsibility to create the conditions in which that can unfold. What I've seen in our youngest kind of learners on site is that they have this incredible joy and curiosity. And what tends to happen in traditional education systems is we terrify and at worst and at best probably bore that out of ourselves. And so I think we've always had it. I think young children know it intuitively, which is that kind of learning can be curious and it can be joyful. And so as adults, I think that's what we need to relearn or find our way back to, is that if learning, as Schumacher said it about work, to make work boring, terrifying, or stultifying would be nothing less of a great human injustice. And so I think the relearning sits for me in how do we bring back curiosity and joy into our own learning processes. And we do that through experience. So it's a part of the work that I love.
It's really beautiful. Yeah, I think bringing both curiosity and joy not only back into our learning, but into our lives and our work as adults is kind of, the central question for many of us, right? It's what we tend to lose along the way, sadly.
Exactly. And it's right in front of us. I think, you just need to take half a moment to observe how a child in their natural way of being, how that just is, it's just so natural to them. So it's always accessible, it's always available, but we've put a lot on top of ourselves, a lot of really intense expectations. And so it's almost like that great social unlearning to return to a more natural way of being.
Now, you mentioned that, you've done some research that's based in grounded theory, and that was your PhD research. And I don't remember the number, but I remember something crazy like that you interviewed 150 sustainability leaders across Africa. Correct me if I'm wrong there. And I don't want to bring back any nightmares by taking it back to your PhD. But I'd just be really interested to know what came out of that process for you. What were some really inspiring stories or people or concepts that came out of that incredibly large process?
I think it's been long enough that the scars have healed a bit. It was certainly a period post-PhD, right? I didn't want to, no one say that word. But I think it's like that for many of us that have been through these intense experiences, academic included. So my research, like you said, I had this incredible privilege of interviewing what ended up being a data set of about 200 global CEOs, board chairs, directors of companies as part of a broader research program where we were trying to understand how do large multinationals fundamentally shift to incorporate planetary boundaries and social foundations into core strategy. So within that work specifically, I think I was really inspired by the more invisible actors in the system. I had gone in with this expectation that, there's a cockpit of pilots and they've got a plan and they're flying this plane very strategically. And if you just, put the right information in their system, they'll calculate a new course. And what I realized was that it's an incredibly high pressure position to be the CEO or kind of board chair of these big organizations, that people are trying to make sense as best they can. But there is too much information in the system. And so what I ended up finding was this incredibly interesting group of people who were supporting leadership to shift the strategy of their organizations, but that they weren't doing this through hard facts. And it was much more, and to me a bit unexpected, around narrative work. So what are the stories we tell and the stories that we believe? And how do those kind of shift and shape the actions that we take over time? So my work ended up kind of contributing into a space around this notion of narrative infrastructure, and how do we construct new narratives, and how do we deconstruct those that are no longer serving us? And I think what was interesting to me is that this is long work and it's deep work. And it was very humbling that these kinds of big systems level changes won't happen overnight. But I have been bowled over. It was entirely unexpected for me. I'm not an epidemiologist, so I didn't see corona coming in this way. Just the extent to which many things we for a long time have believed were not possible have happened overnight. And so in the corporate sector, we've seen, executive leadership take 30 to 40% pay cuts. And that's actually, in fact, in South Africa, been led by the presidency and leaders in government. So things that we never believed, we'd have to kind of really struggle on this narrative around excessive remuneration and deep inequality between highest and lowest earners. It's when necessary action is called on us, and maybe it's about appropriate social peer pressure, and you don't want to be left not taking appropriate action. So I've been very curious and inspired to see the corporate responses to the current crises that we're facing. Yeah, so I guess those are some of the stories within the more corporate space. But I think many inspiring stories sit in different places. Kind of two that I'm really thinking on at the moment is this new initiative we've been partnering with Woolworths and Spear in South Africa to set up a 5-hectare community scale food security farm, learning farm. And so we were very ambitious to think, and we're still kind of building the plane while flying it, that we could bring together not just land reform, so questions of access to land, but also to address major challenges we face in the country around food security, youth skills development, and regenerative agriculture. And kind of at the heart of that, I was really interested around what would be new narratives that we could kind of construct around inclusive agriculture, and also around food security that wasn't left to this kind of mindset of a handout. And I've been blown away by the group of young farmers, all Black, mostly female, who've really come through and taken a leadership role to show that this new narrative is not just possible, but it's something that's deeply desirable. So I think those not necessarily sitting in mainstream spaces. If anything, those are probably, very fringe projects or programs at the moment, but I think they have something really inspiring to offer.
I really love what you said about it all comes down to shifting narratives if we want systems change, because I actually think there's a parallel to that in our own lives as well. If we want to create change in our own lives, we have to observe the narratives that are playing out in our own minds and adjust them and build the new narratives that we want to step into. So I think that that's a really interesting thing to think about. For me, that's always a central question is, how do we parallel creating change in the world with creating change in our lives so that we can both, live a life of purpose, but also live a life that's fulfilling and as we said before, filled with joy. So maybe that's a nice point to sort of talk a little bit more about your personal journey and your personal narratives. And, I've known you for quite a long time. I guess it's well over, or maybe nearly 15 years, which as I say that is quite frightening to think about.
Yeah, it is.
And I was just wondering, obviously in all of that time I've known you, you've been involved in sustainability, but When did that start? So was there any particular turning point in your life or story or incident or person that really influenced you to step into this sustainability oriented career?
I think it's always hard to kind of pinpoint those moments, but there's certainly a few that stand out for me. I remember being about 11, and so if anyone's been to South Africa and visited Cape Town, it's this beautiful city. And so we grew up in the Stellenbosch winelands. We had a kind of a small farm, and one Saturday morning we were going into the city. And if you've been to Cape Town, you'll also know that as you land at the airport, you kind of land amidst a massive township, Gugulethu to Khayelitsha. And so for us to drive in from the farms to the city, you drive, township sits on either side of the highway. And I remember coming back with my dad and saying, like, it just doesn't seem right that I get pocket money. And yet there's a lot of people, I'm extremely privileged. So I grew up in a stable, middle income house. We didn't have periods where we didn't have things. I got access to a really good quality of education. So in my mind at that time, it didn't seem right. And I was like, what, I'm going to give up my pocket money. And my dad said, you can do that. It's an option. He said, but what you've really been afforded is a quality of education that very few people will access. And so that provides you with a platform. And you can give away your 50 Rand, so what's that, probably like €2 that I was getting every month. And it'll make a difference, probably not much. But if you use this platform of education, you can actually really change something. And I think that stuck with me on a lot of levels. It was, I think, privilege, you have to recognize your privilege. To deny it is to insult many, many people who were not born with that. But I think it comes with huge responsibility. And I think when people deny that there's a responsibility or an opportunity to learn, to be more connected, to be humbled, you miss out on something. So that was deeply informative in my own kind of choices around what I learned and what I wanted to do as I grew up. And then the other, being in a position of privilege and going to this really great school, we ended up going on a 28-day hike. And so we were hiking through this absolutely beautiful but quite intense mountain range in the Greater McGregor Pass, probably 15. And because our parents were terrified of us going for a month without school, for some reason the school not only made us do a 20-day hike, but we also had to do homework every day. So one of the things we had to do that day after hiking for 14 hours through Twin Peaks and multiple gorges was write an essay on whether or not they should turn that mountain pass into a road, because it would shorten the travel time between the two towns. And I think it was one of the first times that as a young adult, I was really asked to consider something. And it wasn't about having a right or a wrong answer, but I think the moment that you participate actively in considering something, your mind opens up to the complexity of it. And I became very curious about kind of the experiences between this beautiful natural world and kind of deep social injustice and economic theories and all of those kinds of things. So I went on to study that. I tried to put a degree together that at the time didn't exist. So my undergrad was in oceanography, and I tried to sit in all the philosophy classes that they would let me. And I tried some economics. It was horrible. I hated supply and demand curves. So I often smile when I think of that, because today our institute offers a really cool undergrad program in kind of the intersection between entrepreneurship, sustainability, and the creative arts. And it's totally the degree I would have taken if I could. When I was in my second year, I was, it was climate activism. I was at the University of Cape Town, which was one of the largest concentration of climate scientists on the continent. And so this kind of climate change question was coming up so much. And I found and applied for, I think there'd been somebody the year before, this Youth Encounter on Sustainability, or YES program, which is actually where I met you, Michelle. And it was the first time in my life, I think, that I was surrounded by 30, 40 young people, some older, some younger than myself, who were deeply passionate and active in this world of sustainability. And it was like I found my tribe. So I think when this journey became a little bit more social and a little bit less lonely was when I started to find my own fuel and fire to be more active in my work. Yeah, and it's been a super fun roller coaster since then.
That's so interesting. It's so often that point when you find that tribe and you find that language around what you were having trouble articulating yourself, that you kind of get the confidence to step into it, right?
Absolutely. And I think we're such social beings. Margaret Wheatley writes so beautifully about kind of finding your islands of sanity and joy and community. It's not that the work we do is easy or that it doesn't come with real trauma and real grief, but it's in participating alongside others that we can find forms of joy.
Absolutely. I fully agree with that. And I think that's just an interesting question as well. Like when you look back on your career, do you feel like you were sort of actively plotting it out and then taking one step after the other, or was it more, a series of kind of serendipitous moments that led you somewhere, and it's only looking back that it all makes sense?
I don't think it always makes sense even now. So I mean, I can make up a story that makes it make sense. Kind of oceanography, climate change, food security, corporate education. I mean, there's like a way you could kind of weave that if you tried really hard. Yeah, I think that something I'm leaning into at the moment is this idea of paying attention to your own intuition. And so there's moments when I've followed what seemed like or felt like my conviction. And it's almost always led me to a place that I'm incredibly grateful to be in. And so I think, there's a lot of voices telling you what to do, especially when you're leaving secondary education, when you're in your undergrad. There's a lot of people telling you what you should do. And especially for me, it was like, no, you need to become a doctor, or you need to become an actuarial scientist. And so I had those two voices, the one saying what you should do and the other saying, well, so that was my mom. And my dad was always the one who said, well, as long as you enjoy. And if you wake up on a Sunday not looking forward to a Monday, something's wrong and you need to change. And so I think that balance of voices were very helpful. But at a point, you have to start listening to your own voice. And we were doing some fascinating work last year around deep ecology, feminism, and African perspectives. And I came across this quote by Audre Lorde, which has just really struck me. I think it goes along the lines of kind of a woman's place of power is within each of us. It's dark, it's ancient, and it's deep. And I think that applies not just to women, but to men, to all of us. I think it's our feminine seat of power, is this deep, dark, ancient place. And I feel not yet confident that I'm working from that place, but I think following your intuition, your convictions, we need to pay attention to them, as well as the other voices. But all too often, we don't listen to our own enough.
Yeah, I think that's so true, and particularly when we're younger. And as you said, there are just so many voices and so many different directions that you can go, and it can feel really overwhelming. And it takes us time to develop that calm confidence in our own voice and our own intuition, and to be able to follow that. So sort of nice that you highlighted that.
Or even just to know that it's there. And it doesn't mean that you're going to be confident and brave about it. I'm often not sure. But it's just like, I think that's why a lot of the practices that you often speak about and share with others are so important. It's like the question's always there. It's just sometimes the system's too noisy for us to hear our own question. And so we have to find ways to kind of calm things down just long enough to allow those voices or questions to come up and be a part of the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a process of self-empowerment, I think, which is a long and sometimes arduous journey, but if you can approach it with curiosity, and you'll find a lot of joy along the way as well.
Yeah, I mean, maybe just a small reflection, because sometimes people associate that kind of work with us at the SI. It's like, oh, it's that place, people journal when they go there, and, you talk to plants and such things. But I often am given a day where I'm expected to go into an MBA class or a business school kind of executive leadership program. And in a day, I'm supposed to explain kind of climate change, inequality, strategic shift, culture shift, change agency. And, I've got all these academic outcomes and credits and points and all this stuff I don't really pay too much attention to. And it can be overwhelming because, you get to be that person that comes in and kind of shares the state of the world that's not always that great. And I've learned over the years that in many ways, the most generous thing that I can offer in the time that we have together is the ability or the facilitated experience to self-reflect. Because actually we all know the stuff already. You'd have to be very disconnected from public discourse to not be aware that these issues, you just, for South Africans, you need to simply drive to work to be aware of inequality. And so it's often about actually the sacredness of that space that you can just be able to connect to things that are already in your own mind and your own heart. And obviously I don't come out of the the blocks using words like heart for the business school, but we usually get there by the end of the day.
Yeah, I find that a lot as well in my teaching, which has often been in the setting of a very technically oriented university, that, you know, these days people can Google just about any challenge and find out about it. What they can't do is hear other people's perspective on that challenge, to value that perspective and engage with it. And like you say, to actually understand their own perspective and where it comes from. And I think to link always these big challenges they learn about with their own capability to act in that space, and what are their unique set of strengths and gifts that they can sort of bring to the table and combine with others. And sadly, I just find that those things aren't really at the forefront in our educational institutions, but it's what each of us as humans crave. And the deeper we go with the questions, the more we all find that we're quite similar in the things that we're trying to juggle.
Absolutely. And that's the exciting space, I think, when we start to connect in the work. You just kind of not despite our differences, but kind of even celebrating them.
Yeah, absolutely. So in that space then of these big global challenges and our own personal action, what are some of the challenges that you personally face in doing the work that you do?
I imagine to some extent it's the same we all do, kind of balance between kind of what I'm passionate about and my own health and sanity in the mix. Taking time for myself has been one of the biggest challenges I experience. I've been reflecting on what it is about our upbringings that lead us to believe that that's selfish, or that, even if I'm being very honest, leads me to perhaps condone it in others. So yeah, learning to be able to take time for myself, and not to even, I think sometimes I try and frame it as, oh, then I'll be able to better serve others. And I think even that is a trap, which is denying you that space to say, well, actually this time is just for me, and that's okay. And actually that's a good thing. So I've been reflecting on what is, you know, Protestant, is it Calvin? I'm sure we get very fancy and give it a lot of words, but I do think that we have been brought up within a narrative that values kind of hard work, but at the cost of our own well-being. And there's not always, we might be very smart, but I'm not sure we're very wise. I find myself getting caught up in these never-ending projects around the external world and not always paying equal amount of care and intention to the internal world. So yeah, I guess I struggle with balance and with affording myself the time.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think there's so many narratives that we all have there around, you know, our value and our worth being linked to productivity. And that's, some deep work that as a society we need to reflect on, I think, if we're really going to chart a more sustainable way forward, not only for the world, but for ourselves as well.
There's a Simpsons episode from like the early 2000s, and Homer, it's a terrible episode for many reasons, but Homer washes up on a desert island and he manages to convince all the islanders to build a casino and work in this windowless casino for their whole lives, so that one day they can earn enough money so that they can go on holiday to this desert island where they all happen to actually live right now already. And I think that just struck me so much as, you know, one of the narratives that those of us in a position of privilege can afford to reflect on is that, you know, we're going to work so hard so one day we can have a holiday. And what would it be like to live a life that you don't need to take a holiday from?
And this chance to, like you say, those of us that are privileged enough to be able to work from home and to have the slowing down that is aligned with that, you know, can start to look around and see how much beauty is in your immediate surroundings. And there's no longer that need to escape somewhere else to relax or calm down. You sort of realize that it's all accessible to you right now, if you would just slow down.
Yeah, absolutely.
So then on this note, if you could go back and talk to Jess as she was graduating from university, what would you tell her? What would you tell your younger self?
I think it's maybe what we spoke about a bit earlier, is kind of to listen to the voice within a little bit more than to the voices outside. I think that it's not to say to not care so much of, I think it's to care less of what other people think. But that's very hard, I think, when you're in your early 20s and you're trying to make sense of the world and trying to fit in and belong. I finished reading this amazing book recently by Thomas Armstrong called The Human Odyssey. So I came across his work, a really brilliant book, The Power of Neurodiversity, which trying to find ways of creating much more accommodating and diverse learning environments for people with not just dyslexia, dyspraxia, but kind of seeing these not as disorders, but rather as gifts. And so I'm a huge fan of his work in general, but his work around the human odyssey looks at these 12 stages of life. And I think that there's an incredible gift to be coming out of university. You have this energy that I sometimes wish I could go back and like, I didn't need to drink coffee. I didn't even drink coffee back then. But it came with, for me, a lot of kind of caring what other people thought. And I don't know how. Maybe that's a great question, because I think some days I still do. But I would love to have told kind of graduating self to care a little bit less about what other people think and to care a little bit more about what I do.
The lifelong challenge, huh? So, I mean, on a similar note, is there any sort of practice that you've developed now that you wish you'd already started back then, or something you do every day that helps maybe ground you, give you a little bit of balance or perspective?
I know it's a bit cliche. I get ridiculed at work because every time we try and do some kind of staff wellness thing, I offer yoga and everyone suggests soccer instead. But for me, yoga has been this exceptional place where I connect to myself, my breath, my body in the least judgmental way. I think it's an incredible practice. This quieter time has offered me a space to bring it into my daily practice, and I can just see the benefits, kind of clarity of mind, but also just a calmness. So for some people, whether that's yoga or meditation or breath work, I think they're such important pieces of our life. And if we look at almost any of the ancient traditions and kind of religious systems, prayer kind of is a form of meditation and mindfulness that's integrated into daily experience, as well as gratitude. I think that's so critical. And we know that it has tremendous impacts on our brain and the way in which we think and act from a research perspective. So yeah, I think that's a practice I'm so grateful for. And it never seems to judge me when I get onto the mat and I can't quite touch my toes. So I appreciate that. And I think especially having come from much more disciplined sports, much more competitive sports, there's a gentleness and an invitation that yoga offers to find your edge, which is really lovely. And then the other thing, it's not a daily practice of mine, but it's become a daily experience that I have, which is living in a village. So I moved into the eco village where work is. And in this village, it's one of the few places in South Africa that's so culturally diverse and also safe for children. Mm-hmm. One of the things many South African neighborhoods struggle with is that it's not safe for kids to be on the streets. Gangsterism, crime, a number of things. But thankfully, luckily, our village is. And so many afternoons, the kids come past in a little kind of gang of bicycles, and they, come up for juice or to play a game or something. And it's this never planned, but always welcome interruption. So spending time with young people who seem to have their priorities better sorted than I do is a wonderful daily practice as well.
Yeah, they invite you back into playtime, which we have forgotten how to do.
Yeah, and I'm very lucky that I get to kick them out when it gets a bit rowdy or noisy. So I can imagine for many parents who are trying to navigate this world of homeschooling, and they may not be feeling the equal amounts of gratitude. Yeah, because I can't imagine what it would be like to be caring for young people constantly in this time as well.
Yeah, they're the ones sending the kids to you at a certain point during the day, probably. You mentioned a book before that, has really influenced you. What are some of the key things that you've read in the last year or so that have influenced how you eat or live or lead? And what was the kind of big thing you took away from them?
I mentioned kind of The Human Odyssey by Thomas Armstrong. I think besides offering so many reflections into my life as I've lived it up until now, because it kind of covers all these stages, it was such an incredible piece of work, I think, that considers aging a gift. And I think we live in a society, especially as women, where we are denying the aging process or fighting terribly against it. And it was the first time I read a piece of work that offered a gift of each of all these different life stages, including as we age. And so I thought that was really something tremendous, and I would highly recommend it. It also balances perspectives of kind of remembering our spirit world and our kind of spiritual origins with the challenge of adapting to this physical world that we live in, and what that plays out as kind of as we move through life. And then a book that I'm currently busy with, and I may be for some time because it's about the size of a doorstop, it's absolutely huge, is Women's Bodies, Women's Wisdom by Dr. Christine Northrup. And I don't know if you've come across it, Michelle, but she's a medical doctor who has put together a really consolidated review of what we know and understand from the medical profession around women's bodies, but has woven into it the most exceptional combination of kind of intuition, wisdom, and just a celebration of being a woman and being in our bodies. And it's kind of like the Bible I think I was never given as a young child. I probably would have had no ability to make sense of. And so I'm just thoroughly enjoying it. And yeah, but taking it slow because it's huge.
Sounds like one I'll have to add to the tower that's about to fall over next to my bedside table. So just as a final question that I like to ask all my guests, what does living a great and full life mean for you?
I had a reflection a while ago. I'd actually gone through, I think, what you'd probably term as a burnout. And I always thought a burnout would be something like, you wake up one day and you can't handle it anymore and you physically like finish. But I realized it was a long, slow burn for me. I mean, it came with a combination of kind of a high professional load and kind of a family member who wasn't well and taking care of them and just having nothing left in the tank. And I started to ask kind of questions around like, at the end of my life, what do I want to have achieved? And is this it? And is it worth it? And the one thing that came up for me so clearly is that I don't want to get to the end of my life and be like, well, you know what? I answered all my emails. So it left me not with an answer, but with a bigger question. And I think there's something that comes from a lot of the African wisdom systems and traditions. A lot of people know the word Ubuntu, which is this kind of I am because we are. So my identity is helped to be shaped by the collective. But there's a lesser well-known word, ukama, which kind of comes from the Shona traditions. And the way that I interpret it, and I would so welcome if others could help me to interpret it better, but is this idea of kinship or relatedness. And it's almost a sense of you seeing me helps me see myself too. And so perhaps for me, I'm starting to live into a way of being in which a great and full life, I love that, is maybe one in which I'm in good relation with myself, with others, and with this absolutely crazy, beautiful living world. With all of its complexity and tragedy and trauma, there's a whole bunch of beauty in between too. So a great and full life is one rich in kinship, rich in relation. Yeah, it's not a destination, but it's a beautiful dance.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of the Great Full Podcast. If you liked it, then please go ahead and subscribe and share it with a friend. And I would love to get your questions answered here. So if there's something that you would like answered or explored on this podcast, just send me an email to podcast@thegreatful.com and I'll do my very best to get your questions answered here on the show. Music in this episode came from Blue Dot Sessions.